Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we sift through the most complex theories and radical research to distill the essence of knowledge for you. Today, we are tackling what might be, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, the single biggest conceptual hurdle in human knowledge:
It really is.
the relationship between the physical brain and the felt experience of consciousness. We are diving into a theory that proposes a truly revolutionary solution: the Phenomenal Manifold Hypothesis, or PMT.
Hmm.
And this isn't about describing the mind as, a machine or a program. It's a radical proposal that suggests your conscious, subjective reality, the entire tapestry of thoughts, feelings, memories, can be formalized and understood using the rigorous language of geometry.
Right. It's about giving your mind a mathematically defined shape.
A shape. And that underlying tension you mentioned is precisely why the sciences of the mind are, well, you could say they're in a state of crisis right now.
Absolutely. You have one field, neuroscience, totally dedicated to objectivity.
Right.
I mean, what we can measure, right? The firing rate of neurons, brain waves, the concentration of neurotransmitters,
The hard data.
the hard data. And then you have psychology and psychoanalysis, which deal entirely with subjectivity, the qualia, the feeling of being you, the lived experience.
And they just don't talk to each other.
They don't have a common language. They're studying the same organism, but their vocabularies are so disparate, they often fail to connect in any meaningful way.
It creates this situation where a psychiatrist might diagnose a condition based on a checklist of behaviors.
Yep.
A neuroscientist is looking at fMRI data, and a psychoanalyst is discussing childhood trauma. And none of them have a fundamental common map to link those three perspectives.
They're describing the problem in three different dimensions. And that's the disconnect. This is where the PMT comes in. It proposes to be that necessary Rosetta Stone.
Translate.
The translator. The core goal is to move beyond seeing the mind as just a mechanism, or, chemical soup, and instead provide geometry as that common language. By defining the mind as a topologically structured space, a manifold, we get a way to translate between the objective biological facts and the profoundly personal subjective experience.
And crucially, this isn't just a clever metaphor, is it? We need to be really clear about that.
Not at all. This is a mathematical attempt at definition.
Yeah.
The PMT formally defines the phenomenal manifold, which it calls psi, using a set of minimal psychophysical axioms.
Okay.
The very act of introducing these axioms is an explicit critique of current theories. I mean, they're highly detailed in their own domains, but they lack that rigorous mathematical structure. The goal is a formal phenomenological geometry.
So if the structures of the mind are real, they must be describable.
They must be describable, and this theory provides the tools to actually write down the shape of that structure.
Okay, let's unpack this language, because this feels like the foundation everything else is built on. Before we can talk about psychological trauma as a, quote, geological scar, we have to understand the geology. Why geometry? And specifically, why topology?
Topology is essential here because it's the most abstract and powerful form of geometry for this job. It's the study of shapes, yes, but specifically the properties that remain invariant, that stay unchanged even when you stretch, bend, or continuously deform the object.
So it ignores things like size or local curvature.
Completely. It focuses on the intrinsic properties, connectivity, boundaries, and most importantly for us, the presence of holes.
So the intensity of my subjective experience might change second by second. That would be the local curvature.
Yes.
But the fundamental structure of how I experience reality, like the presence or absence of a hole, that remains constant.
Precisely. The size of your emotional reaction is transient, but the fact that your internal structure contains certain unavoidable voids or circular paths, that's fixed by the topology. And this idea of formalization, it has deep roots, especially in psychoanalysis, through Lacan.
Right, with what he called the matheme.
The matheme, he insisted on it.
What was the drive for that? I mean, why demand mathematical rigor in a field that's so traditionally associated with, intimate verbal conversation?
For Lacan, the matheme wasn't just helpful. He saw it as absolutely necessary. It's not a metaphor. It's not a descriptive analogy. It's a formalism that's required to transmit psychoanalytic knowledge with rigor.
To get it out of the messiness of language?
To allow the concepts to escape the inherent ambiguity, the equivocal nature of human language. If you say love, that word means 1,000 different things to 1,000 people. If you write down a topological equation, it means one thing.
But wait a second. If the matheme tries to capture the structure of the mind, isn't that just replacing one kind of metaphysics with another? Aren't you just saying the mind is a mathematical thing?
That's a brilliant question, and it gets right to the key philosophical function here. The math theme actually serves as an anti-ontological tool.
Anti-ontological, okay.
This is critical. It prevents the mind from being ontologized, from being treated as a fixed, independent thing that exists in the world, like a table or a brain scan. It also stops you from just reducing the mind to biology.
I see.
By insisting the structure is pure abstract geometry, it defines the mind as a thought without qualities. It's a mechanism for studying the structure without having to pin down the metaphysical essence of that structure.
That distinction clarifies so much. It's an epistemology of structure, not an ontology of being. And this immediately forces us to address that deep tension in the source material. The dialogue between rigor and reality, the math theme versus the poem.
Absolutely. The math theme is that drive toward total formalization. A structure so rigorous it could theoretically be written down entirely, escaping all the traps of ambiguous speech. It aims to formalize concepts that are inherently invisible, like unconscious desire.
But even that ambition runs into limits, right?
Yes, and those limits are found in math itself. Lacan, drawing on thinkers like Gödel and his incompleteness theorems, recognized that even pure mathematics encounters an impasse in formalization. No closed system can ever prove its own completeness.
And that inherent failure of logic to capture itself, that points to something outside of logic.
Which brings us to the real.
The real.
The real, in this context, is defined precisely as this impasse. It's the point where language, logic, and formalization all break down. So the math theme, in its attempt at total rigor, ironically acts as the limit locator of the real.
It shows you exactly where the structure of your experience encounters the unsymbolizable, the impossible to say.
Exactly. It defines the boundary of language. But human experience, as we know, rushes past that boundary. And that's where the poem takes over.
Okay, so the poem is everything else.
The poem represents the richness of that messy, ambiguous, subjective reality. It's poetry, myth, discourse that relies on ambiguity and double meanings. But crucially, the poem isn't just aesthetic decoration.
It's functional.
It's a declaration that deliberately operates outside of conventional sense. It is a saying that attempts to touch the real, the impossible, through linguistic means that defy simple definition.
It sounds like the poem is the domain of necessary fiction.
Precisely. The source material highlights that myth as a part of the poem, acts as the discursive formula for something that you cannot transmit as objective factual truth. It gives truth the structure of fiction.
Right, like the myth of Sisyphus. It's not a true story, but it conveys a profound truth about futility and repetition that a simple definition could never capture.
Couldn't get close to it. And the power of the phenomenal manifold hypothesis is its attempt to bring these two seemingly opposed forces together. You have the rigid geometric rules of the math theme defining the container,
which then hosts the richness of our fictional, subjective, and traumatic experience, the poem or the myth.
That intersection is the entire engine of the theory.
So to understand that engine, we have to move to the nuts and bolts, the actual mathematical relationship between the brain and the mind. How does the electrical firing of the brain generate this subjective shape?
Okay, so we use the core mapping function. The PMT posits a neural phenomenal projection, which is symbolized by the Greek letter pi.
Pi.
This is the continuous function that maps the physical state of the brain, that massive objective data set of all the neural activity onto the subjective space, the phenomenal manifold.
And that leads us to the central equation. This is the heart of this deep dive. Let's really break this down. Pi text info plus HI gamma delta dollar.
Okay, let's not rush this. Let's start with the goal. This represents the phenomenal geometry. This is the specific instantaneous shape of your current conscious experience. Right now. The particular mixture of valleys of habit, peaks of surprise, and the fixed underlying wholes that define your inner world in this moment. It's the output.
Okay, so that output is derived from two terms. The first one is EPG text info fun. If we think of our brain as, say, a complex planet, and the phenomenal manifold as the surface of that planet.
That analogy is excellent. So PGGDs is the pullback of the information metric. This term is derived directly from the instantaneous, transient physical brain activity.
The moment-to-moment stuff.
Think of it as the current weather system on the planet's surface. The local rainfall, the winds, the movement of clouds. It's the constant dynamic flow of information. What you're looking at right now, what you're hearing, what you're consciously processing, it's tied to local transient neural firing.
So that first term explains the fluidity of consciousness, but what ensures that I don't feel like a completely new person every minute if my neural activity is constantly changing? That must be the second term, the gamma, delta, the perturbative correction.
This is the critical innovation of the PMT. The dollar term encodes the large-scale informational invariance. So if the first term is the weather,
And this is the geology.
this is the geological bedrock, the fixed continents, the mountain ranges, the deep ocean basins. These invariants, represented by gamma and delta, are constants that determine the overall deep structural features of a person's reality.
So this term determines the fundamental topology of the manifold, the presence of fixed holes or twists, regardless of the neural information currently flowing over it.
Exactly. If your basic phenomenal structure is topologically equivalent to a torus or donut, you will always have that central hole, no matter if you're thinking about breakfast or astrophysics.
The weather has to flow over the landscape that's already there.
The momentary neural data must conform to and be shaped by these deep personal structural constraints. If the terrain is defined by a deep valley, the water will pool there, regardless of how much it's raining.
This defines the brain's role beautifully. The brain isn't just generating content, it's acting as the engineer that constructs this road, this manifold, in real time. It's using the objective information metric, but it has to adhere strictly to the structural blueprint defined by that H term.
It means the brain is simultaneously a dynamic processor and a rigid constructor of fundamental form.
Okay, understanding that geometry, it just shifts our entire framework. Let's apply this immediately to psychology. Most of what we think of as personality is derived from trait lists, filling out surveys, describing behaviors.
Right, the current paradigm in psychology is very focused on describing what a person does. We use things like personality inventories or child development tools like the IDD. And the IDA is constantly being refined, moving from simple 2-point scale to 3-point scales to try and incorporate quality.
Trying to get more nuance.
This constant struggle for finer resolution just shows the limits of trying to quantify inherent structure using linear lists.
So the manifold paradigm throws out the list and replaces it with a map. We move toward what the sources call topologic personality.
And the mind ceases to be a file cabinet of traits and becomes a complex, dynamic terrain with valleys and mountains. Personality is the shape of this subjective space. It's the topography, the fixed contours of the landscape defined by our personal invariants.
And the movement across that terrain is what defines our actions. Let's explore that dynamic element with the analogy of attention.
Oh, attention is beautifully rendered here as water flowing over this terrain. Water will always follow the path of least resistance.
Right.
The overall inherent shape of your personality manifold, your topography, determines where that flow naturally pools.
The deep valleys of preoccupation.
Or where it's repelled, the steep, inaccessible peaks.
That immediately gives structure to things like rumination or fixation. If you're prone to anxiety about a specific subject, it's because the landscape is permanently shaped as a deep valley leading to that topic. Your attentional water just pools there almost inevitably.
Precisely. And this geometric view completely transforms how we understand emotion. Emotion isn't some static state you can just measure on a chart. Happy, sad, anxious.
It's not a point on a map.
It's not. Emotions are curvatures or trajectories. They are the dynamic movement of the subject across the terrain. Intense emotion is experienced where the curvature is steep, a quick, sharp descent or ascent. Boredom might be a vast, flat plane with very little contour.
And the clinical implications of that are immediate. Give us an example of a complex emotion like anxiety, viewed topologically.
Well, traditional views often categorize anxiety by symptoms: high heart rate, worry, agitation. But geometrically, anxiety is linked to the nothingness or the void that the subject senses in their own structure. It's the internal recognition of a fundamental lack that you have to constantly barricade yourself against.
So you feel anxious because your structure requires you to circle a hole you can never truly fill.
Yes. And to understand those necessary voids, we can turn to the first specific topological object mentioned, the torus, the donut shape.
Right.
The torus is highly descriptive of the structure of a speaking being. It possesses two fundamental productive voids. The central hole running through the middle,
Okay.
and the internal void, the not a fundamental or a fundamental nothingness,
Yeah.
which is the internal space you'd need to excavate to create the torus in the first place.
And the significance is that these voids are not passive absences. They actually create necessary movement.
They generate two irreducible cyclical paths that define our basic subjective structure: the path of desire and the path of demand. We are constantly circling these emptinesses, attempting to fill the structural lack they represent.
So the Torah shows that our trajectory through life is intrinsically constrained by these foundational emptinesses.
It makes the interplay between desire and demand not some historical accident, but an intrinsic geometric necessity.
Okay, the next key geometric form addresses the problem of the divided subject, the continuity between our inner world and the external world. That's the Mobius strip.
The Mobius strip is so elegant because it just subverts our common sense representation of space. You can hold it in your hand, a strip of paper with a single half twist. It has only one side and only one edge.
So if we map consciousness onto this strip, the fundamental distinction between the inside and the outside of the self, it just collapses into a continuous surface.
That's the aha moment. It serves as a model of a transcendental aesthetic, demonstrating the continuity between the top side and the underside. A subject tracing the surface of their own reality, their internal thoughts, will inevitably find themselves traveling to the external world of action or speech, and back again, without ever crossing a true boundary.
The only thing separating what feels inside from what feels outside is the time it takes to complete the path around that twist.
Yes, and this continuity is crucial for understanding complex psychic phenomena like repetition compulsion. It's essential. The Mobius strip illustrates the continuity between the repeated and the repeating. Repetition doesn't produce a perfect copy. The movement itself leaves a trace. Because the surface is continuous, the return is slightly shifted, structurally incorporating the history of the repetition itself. This surface reveals a structural element that is unmeasurable and uncountable, but present structurally.
And that trace, that element that is always added when the movement returns, is named explicitly in the sources.
That structural residue, the single edge that defines the entire strip, is referred to as the one in addition, one too much desire.
Wow.
So the Mobius strip provides the geometric proof that the subject is inherently divided, yet their inner and outer experience is continuous, and that desire isn't a psychological drive, but the topological trace left by the movement of repetition itself.
Okay, moving from the divided subject to the structured unconscious, we arrive at psychoanalysis. Geometry offers a language to talk about the psyche that moves beyond Freud's early hydraulic models, the flow of energy, and even beyond the structural models of id, ego, and superego.
Freud's genius was recognizing the structural nature of the psyche. He evolved from his early neurological project to the later models focused on the life and death drives. But Lacan sought to move from those spatial metaphors to true mathematical structures.
He said if the unconscious is structured like a language, we have to use the most rigorous language possible, mathematics, to transmit its form.
Exactly. And the ultimate formalization of this is the Borromean knot, which maps the three fundamental registers of human reality.
RS and A.
The Borromean chain is the structural template of human reality. It formally unifies the real, R, symbolic S, and imaginary I registers. For anyone listening who is unfamiliar, imagine three rings, like three Olympic rings, but linked in a very specific way.
And the fundamental property is the key.
The fundamental property is this. If you cut or remove any one ring, the other two immediately fall apart.
The sheer implication of that property is just staggering. It means our capacity to imagine ourselves, the imaginary, our ability to use language and law, the symbolic, and our connection to the raw reality of existence, the real. They aren't just related, they're mutually interdependent.
If one link fails, our entire reality structure collapses.
Yeah.
And for the psychoanalyst, this knot is precisely where the phenomenal manifold gives form to desire. Desire isn't a wish. It's an articulation defined by the limits of this space.
And that central region where the three rings intersect.
That defines the location and function of object, the object cause of desire.
Let's ground this in something clinical. Trauma and repression. If the old model was a mechanical blockage of energy hysterics suffering from reminiscences, as Freud put it, how does the PMT describe trauma?
Trauma and repression get redefined spatially, not energetically. They aren't just temporary blockages. They are knots, or cicatrizes geologicus, geological scars, that permanently alter the geometry of the terrain. Imagine a river of mental flow suddenly encountering a deep, unmovable scar on the landscape, forcing the flow to devote permanently around it. This is a structural change to the manifold itself.
And this geometric distinction must be incredibly useful for classifying different psychical structures, particularly the difference between neurosis and psychosis.
It provides a clarity that symptomatic checklists simply cannot offer. Repression, which is characteristic of neurosis, involves an internal inhibition. It's a defense mechanism that keeps conflict contained within the knot. The structure remains intact, though maybe under great stress.
So the subject is still circling the conflict, and psychosis is a more radical failure.
Yes, psychosis involves a radical foreclosure or rejection, which manifests as a structural soltura, an untying or fragmentation of one of the psychic structures. We have these visual models where, for instance, the imaginary ring detaches completely from the real and the symbolic.
That untying is the structural defect.
It's the rejection of the symbolic law, the name of the father. The reality of the psychotic subject is fundamentally unbound.
This brings us back to the heart of the knot, to the object. If the knot is the structure, what is this object?
Object is the fundamental whole in the structure. It's the piece that's missing, the impossible to be represented rest that the subject is internally excluded from. You can't point to it, it's only defined by the movement around it.
Right.
The entire structure of fantasy, represented as Diamond Head, is the mechanism, the geometric trajectory that supports the divided subject's desire by relating him directly to this necessary structural whole. The whole is what drives the desire, not what fulfills it.
That relationship between the divided subject and the fundamental whole gets modeled by an even more esoteric surface, the crosscap. Tell us why this surface is so vital for understanding vision and fantasy.
The crosscap is topologically equivalent to the Moebius strip with a disk closing it off. But its key feature is that it's unilateral, and it achieves continuity between its external and internal faces via a line of self-intersection.
So it models how something fundamentally internal can relate to something external through a twist, a fundamental contradiction at its core.
Exactly. It shows how the fantasy, diamond acrit, is constructed. It specifically illustrates how the subject, who is inherently divided, enters and structures the field of the scopic drive, the drives related to vision and the gaze. When we look at the world, we're structuring that vision based on an internal geometry.
And the resulting structure reveals a profound truth about subjective experience and reality itself.
The crosscap supports this idea that the world can only be represented by the subject on condition that the subject does not fully represent himself within that world.
The excluded subject is essential for the world to be representable.
And the object, in its form as the gaze, is what escapes visibility. It's the point of view, the blind spot, but it's paradoxically what supports the entire edifice of desire and the world as seen by the subject.
The structural insights from topology give the psychoanalyst a roadmap for desire. But perhaps the most radical potential lies in psychiatry. I mean, the current model, dominated by the DSM, is just a descriptive catalog of symptoms.
The modern standard, the DSM, is essentially a nosology based on statistical clusters of observable symptoms. We measure depressive symptomatology based on reported frequency, sleep patterns, energy levels.
A checklist.
It's a checklist. And the flaw here is that two people can present with identical symptom lists, the same observable weather, but the underlying structural failure in their phenomenal manifold might be radically different. A DSM diagnosis tells you what the person is suffering from, but not how their reality is structurally constituted.
So in the manifold paradigm, the psychiatrist uses geometry to define the structure to pathology. The disorders aren't just neurochemical, they're fundamental shifts in the underlying geology of the mind.
We view them not as temporary chemical imbalances, but as dramatic, persistent alterations to the terrain. They are terremotos, earthquakes, or congélamentos, freezings, that fundamentally alter the topological shape of the subjective landscape. They determine the very kind of experience the subject is capable of having.
Let's put this to the test. Let's propose a geometric diagnosis framework based on the Burmeian knot, contrasting neurosis and psychosis.
Okay, the differential diagnosis is no longer about severity, but about structure. So neurosis is defined by a phantasmatic reality. The Burmeian knot remains tied.
The structure holds.
The structure holds, even if it's incredibly painful. The subject manages internal conflict dualisms, conflicting drives through secondary defenses, like repression and symptom formation. The fantasy, the diamond's A, is successfully contained within the boundaries of the knot, giving reality a certain stability.
Even if it's a painful one, the conflict is internal, contained, and managed by the existing structure.
Correct. Psychosis, conversely, is characterized by the fragmentation of continuity. It is the non-knotting, the soltura, the untying of the RSI rings. This leads to a reality that is delirante, delusional, because the three registers necessary to construct a shared symbolic reality are not holding together.
So the world, the body, and language can just fragment independently.
Yes, the classic example is the foreclosure of the symbolic, where the imaginary detaches. The very mechanism for integrating oneself into the social structure fails.
What about mood disorders? They seem to involve...
Mania could be conceptualized as an acceleration of flow, a runaway trajectory across the manifold without the necessary structural containment. The curvature becomes too steep, the movement too fast, and the constraints, those invariants in the age term, are temporarily ignored or overwhelmed.
A temporary unsustainable speed.
Exactly. Unable to settle into any fixed reality.
This means that if the core pathology is geometric structure, then treatment must also be structural. We shift from medicating chemicals to, well, re-engineering terrain.
That's the core clinical implication. Treatment is re-terraplanar, re-engineering the fundamental landscape of subjective experience. Now, this doesn't exclude pharmacology, but it reframes it. Medication might suppress the transient weather.
The buy part.
Right. But a structural intervention, the Analytic Act, aims to address the bedrock, the dollar gamma delta term.
And how does the Analytic Act function as geometric re-engineering?
The analytic practice, especially within the Lacanian tradition, uses language as a tool for making topological cuts. The goal is to reveal the underlying structural void, a bagesi, that the subject is circling. In cases of structural fragmentation, particularly psychosis, the intervention aims to create new linkages.
A new knot.
The analyst seeks to introduce a synthome, a stabilizing element that functions as a fourth knot, forcing the unknotted registers back into a stable entanglement.
So therapy in this light is less about insight and more about stabilizing the geometry of reality itself.
It's architectural work. We see this even in complex historical cases like the Wolfman. His shifting diagnostics and various therapeutic attempts can be viewed as efforts to find a stable knotting mechanism, a synthome, to stabilize the otherwise untied components of his subjective reality. The goal isn't cure, but structural stabilization.
Which brings us full circle, back to the hard problem. We've defined the phenomenal manifold. We've mapped personality onto it. We've used it to diagnose structural failure. Now, how does the sophisticated geometry actually help the neuroscientists tackle the transition from objective neuron firing to subjective qualia?
This is where the geometric model functions as that crucial layer intermediary, the middleware. It's the translator. The physical, objective firing of neurons is mapped onto the geometry of the manifold via the projection function, pi.
Right.
And the subjective experience, the qualia, is that resultant shape. The geometry is the subjective experience.
The brain is the engineer, and the geometry is the finished road, which the mind then drives on.
Exactly. Current neuroscientific models, while they're powerful, they often lack the necessary formal geometry to talk to the rich subjective models of psychology and psychoanalysis. They can measure the activity, but they can't define the form of the resultant feeling. The PMT provides the mathematical language for this geometric integration.
So, if the brain is constantly integrating these massive amounts of disparate sensory and cognitive information, visual, auditory, memory, how does the manifold resolve the problem of unification? Why doesn't our consciousness feel like 5 separate data streams?
The unification is achieved not by mixing chemicals, but by the fact that the brain folds and shapes all that disparate information into a single, coherent topological space. The form itself resolves the problem.
Okay.
Since the geometry is derived directly from the total information metric, MAG, text info, the final output is a single, unified, coherent space. It's impossible for the manifold to exist in fragmented pieces simultaneously under the central equation. The coherence is baked into the mathematical requirement of the space itself.
And the constraints of the physical body must play a massive role in this construction, right? The engineer can only build the road within certain physical boundaries.
Absolutely. The constitution of the subjective self is intrinsically tethered to the body's structure and the primal drives. The body provides the foundational boundary conditions and the initial structure that the engineer works with.
The raw materials.
Raw materials. The source material references how the basic drives, the oral, the anal, the scopic drive, are tied to specific early topological surfaces, often related to the torus. The body gives the initial raw material and defines the potential holes and twists that the conscious experience will organize itself around.
So the geometry of the mind isn't arbitrary. It's constrained by the biological needs and limitations of the body it inhabits.
The physical body determines the initial structural invariance. If you are born with a body that has a mouth and an anus, you are topologically predisposed to certain cycles of desire and demand. The engineer, the brain, has to build the phenomenal road that accommodates those pre-existing, non-negotiable structural requirements.
This has been an extraordinary deep dive. The phenomenal manifold hypothesis forces us to move so far beyond the simplistic dichotomy of mind versus brain. We're compelled to see consciousness not as an ethereal substance or a black box, but as a malleable, mathematically defined space, a highly personalized, living geometry.
And the PMT offers an unprecedented unification of these warring disciplines.
Hmm?
We can summarize its radical impact, unified by the language of geometry.
Let's do it.
Okay. For the second lista, the manifold gives form to desire. Desire is not merely a history of wishes, it is defined structurally through the necessary knots, holes, and the location of the fundamental lack, objectively.
And for the psychiatra, the manifold gives structure to pathology. Diagnosis shifts from symptomatic checklists to identifying the specific type of topological failure, be it fragmentation like in psychosis or collapse in depression, or runaway acceleration in mania.
And finally, for the neuroscientista, the manifold gives geometry to information. It functions as the critical middleware, the translator that connects objective neural data to coherent subjective experience, finally providing a formal mathematical structure for qualia.
This deep dive reveals that the most profound structures of our inner life, our traumas, our desires, our very sense of reality, might be defined not by their content, but by their shape. It makes the idea of therapeutic intervention as reterraplaning feel incredibly necessary and concrete.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. For you to explore as you go about your day, observing the weather patterns over your own fixed geological terrain. Talvez a mente não seja o que o cérebro tem, mas o formato que a experiência assume. Perhaps the mind is not what the brain has, but the format that experience assumes.